Nope. Perfect. Good, I will be able to see it. Okay. I want to begin by saying Laudato Si, Pope Francis. Praise be to you. Because I think it's important right here at the beginning that I say that I very much appreciate Laudato Si, in part because with this text, Pope Francis intervened in a number of ongoing conversations in a decisive manner, and he drew the attention of many to matters that should very much be of concern to all of us. The rhetorical force of the encyclical brought many people into conversations about our fate and what I think is much too hastily called the fate of the world. And its force didn't extend only to conversations, but also to many initiatives and actions seeking to improve the health and lives of people and communities of both humans and non-humans. So I think it's important to begin with this appreciation and praise because much of what I want to say today is critical of the encyclical and of its reception. But I hope you'll see that I seek not to dismiss the text, but to get to the very heart of its concern. Not to stop at the threshold of thought and action or to attempt half measures, but to share in the unfolding of the very care of which the encyclical speaks. So here we are 10 years out from the publication of Laudato Si. And despite the Paris Accords, we continue down the well-worn path of business as usual. Our attempts to bend the curve have been feeble, marginal at best. I wonder whether this is because we've attempted to reduce pollution. I wonder if it's because we have attempted to combat environmental decay, to stop the depletion of material resources, as well as to stem global inequality and to improve working conditions. I wonder whether this is because we've attempted to set our house in order but continue to neglect care for our common home. We fail to care with distinction between house and home, and the distinction between earth, planet, globe, and world. We fail to devote ourselves to what Pope Francis calls a distinctive way of looking at things, a way of thinking, a lifestyle and spirituality which together might disarm the technocratic paradigm. Might our failure be related to the tendency to refer to Laudato Si as Francis's environmental encyclical, and the tendency to begin so many discussions of Laudato Si with a review of the science and the state of the planet? Might our failure be related to the tendency to assess whether the external deserts of the world are growing while neglecting to assess with even greater concern whether those internal deserts that Pope Benedict reminded us of are growing more and more vast? We're failing to care with distinction, and the failure is twofold. First, the failure to care for conceptual distinctions between house and home, as well as between earth, planet, globe, and world. And second, a failure to care materially in embodied, practical, and institutional ways for distinctions that make a difference in the world. So as a result of our failure to care with distinction, we remain trapped within the conceptual schemas and habitual actions that have led to and reinforce the very challenges we're supposedly striving to overcome. So we fail to care with distinction. First, the distinction between house and home. We meet with this failure before even opening the encyclical and reading its first paragraph. Although I haven't done an extensive literature review, I'm not familiar with any text that's noted the strange differences which should have aroused our thought between the subtitle of the encyclical as it appears in different languages. I think the fact that so little thought, so little attention has been directed toward the quite distinct subtitles of the encyclical, it's an indication of the challenges and thoughtlessness that confront us. For even if there are texts that do so, the fact that most people pass over these differences without comment is an indication of the confusion and the problems to which I'm referring. Even in the German language, which makes a distinction quite similar to the English distinction between house and home, it's the word for house that appears in the subtitle. In French, not only is the word for house, la maison, used, but the subtitle is rendered as sur la sauvegarde de la maison commune. While in other Romance languages like Spanish and Italian, a different word for care is used, so we have el cuidado in Spanish and la cura in Italian. In both of these languages, it's the word for house that's used, and I think that this is no doubt due, at least in part, to the fact that there's no exact equivalent for the English home in those languages. But in any case, such differences call for thinking, and I believe ultimately for acting quite differently. For what does it mean to care for our common home? To answer the question, we need to distinguish first, what constitutes a home? Second, we need to ask, what does it mean to care? And third, how care relates specifically to a home, as distinct from some other thing or state of affairs, such as a house. I don't think that Laudato Si addresses any of these questions adequately, nor does it address, or have we addressed, a related question, which I alluded to by just looking at the subtitles, the differences in the languages in the subtitles. And that is, what's the relation between home and language? Can we share a common home without sharing a common language? And then what does that look like? A home differs from a house in the way in which each is raised up and sustained. The house is a product of work. It's a work issuing from work. It's built up out of stone and wood. Okay, it's raised up out of brick and mortar. And as a work, the house has a certain independence from its maker. One manifestation of this independence is the ability of the house to remain standing after all of its inhabitants have departed. Another manifestation of this independence is the ability to buy or sell a house, or to give or receive a house as one might give or receive a gift. The raising of the house gives rise to more than walls and a roof and more than a piece of property. It also gives rise to the elevation of the house within our cultural symbolic. The house comes to be viewed as belonging to the gear or equipment consisting of things necessary for human life. The house comes to be viewed as a condition for human activity, and in this sense, the commencement of that activity. It comes to occupy a privileged place in the system of finalities in which human life is imagined to maintain itself. And as a result, it gives rise to the domination of labor by work. And I'll come back to that distinction between labor and work later because I think it's quite important. A home, on the other hand, is not a thing among things. It's not a collection of things. It's not made in the way of things. It's not built up out of stone and wood, and it's not raised up out of brick and mortar. Its materiality is of a much more subtle nature, of breath and blood, of hands and heart, of attentive eyes and ears. A home may enjoy an abiding stability, but it knows nothing of an enduring presence. The stability of the home abides in the labors of sharing through which a home is brought forth, raised up, and sustained. The home abides through and within such sharing. And thus, when this sharing dissipates or disappears, the home also dissipates or disappears. The home does not endure beyond the passing of those who dwell in the sharing of the home, whereas a house does. It might be said that we humans inhabit the same house, but it cannot be said that we share a common home. And Pope Francis, I think, seems to sense this. For example, he notes in paragraph 51 of Laudato Si that developing countries do in less developed countries, exporting to them solid waste and toxic liquids and producing pollution, what they would never do at home. Of course, this distinction's lost in the French, the Spanish, the Italian, the Polish, and the German renditions of the text. That English word home doesn't appear anywhere in there. There's not even a reference to house. So he also notes the very different ways in which foreign debt and ecological debt are treated, indicating that rather than sharing a common home, we're at odds with one another over the riches of a divided house. And there are a lot of other examples in the encyclical that we could go to, but time won't allow, but hopefully you'll start looking for some of these. So to set in relief the differences between house and home, consider the approach of an impending storm. And indeed, it's a storm that doesn't merely threaten on a distant horizon, but it's really one that's already crashing down around us. What does it mean to safeguard our house in the face of such a storm? And what does it mean to care for our home in such circumstances? And can't we successfully safeguard our house and still lose our home? And might we not care for our home even as our house becomes uninhabitable? Now, some are going to argue that we're in danger of losing our house and that we'll thereby lose the basis on which any home abides. But I'm not sure that it's clear that what's called the climate crisis or planetary tipping point signal such a loss. Although these current crises, in which the moment of decision in many respects is already well behind us, they no doubt portend a challenging and diminished context in which to live. In other words, a much less inhabitable house. It's not clear that they necessarily mean the end of our home. Okay, so caring with distinction. What does it mean? What does the distinction between home and house, why does it matter? Because in failing to attend to it, we fail to care with distinction. It has to be said again and again, caring for a home is not equivalent to caring for a house. And caring for the latter can even impede or undermine caring for the former. Much of our care is directed towards the management and maintenance of a house rather than the safeguarding and nurture of a home. We fail to embody a distinctive way of caring for our common home, a distinctive way of looking at things, of thinking, a lifestyle and spirituality which together generate resistance to the technocratic paradigm. If I were to suggest a name for this distinctive way of caring for our common home, it would be labor. And I mean by labor something like what Hannah Arendt distinguishes from work. Labor corresponds to the condition of life itself. Through labor, we care for the vital necessities of life: clean water, nourishing food, protection from the elements. We care for our bodies and for the earth. Labor is a recurring circular movement. We're never done with it as long as we live. But unlike Arendt, I think we need to reject the old philosophical hierarchy that subordinates labor to all other forms of action, as well as to contemplation, and instead accord labor the dignity that it deserves. For we accomplish our humanity, we accomplish our homes, not through work, nor through speaking and acting in the world, nor through contemplation, but by sharing in those labors through which a world unfolds and abides between us. We labor here on this ground with one another, and through and within these labors, we come to share a common destiny. A home unfolds and abides in the sharing of these labors. And just as an aside, I want to draw a connection between this focus on labor and a theme that often is brought up in discussions of Laudato Si. A lot of lip service gets paid to the importance of indigenous knowledge, but much less attention is devoted to indigenous ways of living, which are often centered around labor and the sharing of labor rather than around work or action. Although attending to the centrality of labor might also help us to assess Pope Francis's concern that his proposals might be taken to suggest sending us back to the Stone Age, right? He seems very nervous. He doesn't want anybody to think I'm suggesting you go back to the Stone Age here. But perhaps we have a lot to learn from the Stone Age, particularly about living insofar as their ways of living were centered around caring for the common home through the sharing of labor. So our task isn't simply to look at reality in a different way, but it's to live in a different way. And I would call that different way labor. Okay, so labor as the way to care for our common home points toward the second set of distinctions I want to address today, the distinctions between earth, globe, planet, and world. As with home and house, we tend to treat these terms as if they were equivalent, and we use them interchangeably, which is to say, I think we use them thoughtlessly. When we do so, we fail to care with distinction, and we fall prey in subtle and perhaps unconscious ways to a technocratic paradigm. And Francis alludes to the powerfully, the unconscious ways in which we do tend to fall prey to it. And I think the uses of planet and globe in particular, but also the conflation of earth, planet, globe, and world are examples of the hold of the technocratic paradigm on our own thinking. So if time allowed, we'd need to think through how world differs in fundamental ways from earth, planet, and globe. And I think this would require thinking phenomenologically about world and the ways in which a pre-comprehension of world lies behind our current understanding of earth, planet, and globe. And so I recommend going back to Heidegger's Being and Time and looking at world and what he says there as a starting point. This thinking would allow us to see better how the distinction between world and then earth, planet, and globe is related to the distinction between home and house. Now, although we often use the words earth, planet, and globe interchangeably, there's a sense of earth that doesn't sit well with planet or globe. And it's a sense that many 21st century urban dwellers are in danger of losing. This is the sense of earth as the wine-dark sea upon which Odysseus sails, as well as the island of Ithaca where the olive tree from which his bedpost is made stands and beckons him homeward. This is the desert through which Israel wandered for 40 years. It's Pahasapa, the Black Hills that are holy to the Lakota people and won't be given over to the United States government for a settlement of cash. It's the stretch of Lake Michigan where we take our morning walks. It's primordial, stretching back into the mists of time. Its boundaries are not really marked on any map, residing instead in the hearts and imaginations of those who dwell there. Songs are sung of it, and poems are written and recited about it, and even those who don't think of themselves as sprung from it will someday return to it. The earth is that solid ground on which I stand, above which the sun rises, and below which it sets, and around which the stars turn. The earth, as in planet Earth and Earth system, are quite different from this small e Earth. And just as an aside, my wife and I wrote an article that was in NCR's Earthbeat a couple years ago, and it was so difficult to get them to understand why we didn't want big E Earth everywhere in what we were trying to say. Couldn't get their minds around this distinction. But as concepts, planet Earth and Earth system, they're the result of men like Copernicus, decentering the Earth, and Newton describing the laws of motion governing any heavenly body. I don't stand on any heavenly body. I stand on this small e Earth. And they're also the result of intrepid souls like Magellan circumnavigating the globe and NASA astronauts snapping pictures from space. And they're the result of dedicated scientists with microscopes and telescopes and a whole host of other technical equipment who labor tirelessly to unlock the hitherto secret workings of our planet. When the concepts of globe and planet and Earth system are employed, and not just employed, but allowed to structure and direct our thoughts and actions, we take over and are taken over by the results of the technocratic paradigm. These concepts are the conceptual and material products of the logics and economies of market-driven technoscience. They are not neutral or innocent concepts. They shape and constrain our imaginations and hence our sense of what is possible. They shape our horizon of understanding, that is, our world, preventing us from perceiving what lies beyond them, new other ways of gathering, binding, and belonging. If it teaches us anything, the history of globalization these past 500 years, and in an accelerated and intensified fashion the past 75 years, they teach us that we do not share a common home, but instead compete with one another over the rule and exploitation of a divided house or planet. And there's little possibility we can share a planet or a globe when we haven't even learned how to share within our nation states or within our cities and towns. The sharing of labor, I think, points the way towards what's required to care for our common home. Our lives and our world are currently organized around a distribution of labor, an unequal and unjust distribution of labor, rather than a universal sharing of labor. Globalization is the name for this unequal and unjust distribution of labor. Labor is looked upon as something to be minimized, if not avoided, something to be foisted upon others, often feminized others, toiling halfway around the globe. We think of it as something degrading or debasing, associated with our animality rather than with our divinity. Yet to care for our common home requires us to share universally in the labors through which alone a home can unfold, rise up, and abide. So where do we go from here? We need to stop relying upon the prospects of ecological or planetary catastrophe to motivate, guide, or assess our actions. We need to do so first because such catastrophe is but a symptom of the deeper disease driving it. That is, of the internal desertification that's driving the growth of the external deserts. And we need to do so second because such catastrophes are perhaps not as catastrophic as other scenarios through which humans have flourished and can imagine themselves capable of flourishing. And I'm thinking of my friend Tom Hewson's book on Neanderthals and the fact that they lived in a Europe that experienced great climatic variation over 300,000 years with a much more primitive toolkit than you or I have, and thrived and flourished for most of those years, at least until humans came on the scene, and then they quickly disappeared, or modern humans, anatomically modern humans. So Laudato Si got people talking. But to talk is one thing and to think is another, as is to act. Are we yet thinking or acting in the ways that are essential? I wonder whether what Heidegger said of his time is also true of ours. That in this thought-provoking age, what is most thought-provoking is that we're still not thinking. And we might add that in our action-filled frenetic age, an age almost devoid of quiet and stillness, we're still not acting in the ways that are essential. We continue to think, to speak, and to act far too much in terms of carbon dioxide levels, biodiversity loss, and planetary boundaries. As important as these themes may be, and I'm not suggesting they're not unimportant, but I'm saying that we need to get back to the heart of the matter, which is very much a matter of the heart. It's about the way that we live with one another. Why are we still not measuring or assessing our progress with regard to the challenges facing us in terms of reducing noise and distraction? Francis talks about those in Laudato Si too, but I don't see people starting the conferences by talking about, has the world gotten quieter? Are we a little less distracted now? Or slowing down the pace of life, right? Rapidification is another one of those themes. Well, is our lives less frenetic? Is there some connection between the lack of reduction in that and the rising CO2 levels? Or the healing of our hard-heartedness and the greed and suspicion that travel with it? Or our sharing in the labors necessary to sustain and nurture life? Why do we continue to look away from ourselves and the ethical spiritual conversion needed to respond to the challenges facing us? We seem to believe that we can stop the spread of the external deserts of our world without first addressing the internal deserts from which they arise. If we're to care for our common home, we must get clear about what constitutes a home as distinct from a house, so that we can also get clear about what caring for a common home entails. Among other things, such care entails a sharing by all who dwell within the home in the labor of safeguarding and nurturing that home. Sharing the labors through which a home, as distinct from a house, emerges, rises up, and abides. It's in this labor of caring for our common home, I believe, that we will regain living contact with that earth, small e earth, which safeguards and nourishes us. In this way, the material and symbolic forces of globalization and planetization will loosen their grip so that the truly universal sharing, a truly universal common destiny, not merely planetary or global, might announce itself. To close, although I'm not sanguine about our ability to bend the curve, to lower CO2 levels, to stop biodiversity loss, to reduce pollution, nor am I sanguine about our ability to address global inequality or economic exploitation, I am confident that we can begin here and now to share in the labors of caring for a common home, to share in the processes of healing our hearts and hands, our relations with one another and to the earth, and that if we do so, we might not only slow or stop the spread of our internal deserts, but begin to see how to live well together in whatever external deserts we find ourselves. Thank you.
I think we can fudge time a little bit because we have lunch coming to us rather than us going to lunch. So I'd like to go ahead and still try to take 5 or 10 minutes for questions before we have Edgar speak. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Stephen. Excellent. And I'm wondering, Arendt makes that distinction between animal laborans and homo faber, and it seems to be more like the labor is bad, but the homo faber, the work that we do to create a shared world, is preferable. Would you give any thoughts on that in relation to your distinction of labor versus work?
Yeah, I think I want to push back on Arendt's placing such great emphasis on work as providing us with that kind of the stability of a world. I think that labor does that well before work comes to dominate our existence. So that if you look back historically and anthropologically, as well as in our own lives, I think there's all kinds of ways in which the sharing of labor constitutes a stable world, if not an enduring one. It doesn't endure in the same way that tables and chairs do. And so part of our problem is to see the misplaced emphasis on work and the devaluation of labor. I mean, we're almost all universally agreed labor is bad and to be avoided. Let the machines do it. Let somebody less advantaged than me do it. And we fail to see that it's the very path through which we might accomplish our human existence. I mean, that it's a way in which we spiritualize the world and ourselves and kind of achieve proper human dignity. So not by shirking it, but rather by sharing in it in some way. And Arendt can't see that at all. I mean, she doesn't even want to challenge it, right? She just takes over the old philosophical categorization, and she still wants to see work and action, and specifically action and speech, as more important. Yeah, Tom?
Well, thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate your continual, not only in this talk, but in conversations and other gatherings, invitation to think, to thought. You help us think. Thank you. There's one particular theme in Lonergan that I wonder if this seems accurate, where you and he have something in common. In the first section of the chapter on meaning and method and theology, he talks about intersubjectivity. And intersubjectivity prior to I thou, the we, that enables somebody who sees somebody stumbling to, give them a hand, lend a hand, or somebody's fallen into the water, people will go to the rescue without theoretical considerations of any sort. There's a spontaneous solidarity there, and I wonder if that primordial we is something that you're kind of invoking, especially in the last part of your talk on laboring in the home.
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, I'd say there's a lot of affinity between what you're suggesting, what you're saying Lonergan is describing, and what I would advocate for, that the we does precede the I and the you, and that it's through that, the sharing of that we, that identities become constituted in various ways. So that it's kind of the bedrock of human existence, that intersubjective sharing. And it's something that modern materialism and capitalism parasitically, vampirically live on, but can't do without. That's the reproductive labor, right? Generally feminized, and it takes place hidden away in the home or somewhere else, that continues to bring humans into the world in some way. And it's I would say capitalism, materialism, individualism take up and take over that sharing and that labor and put it to work, rather than continuing to share in it in some fashion.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate the depth of concern and critique that you bring to this, making us think about these things. I guess the question I have is how much is your critique a critique of the reception of Laudato Si versus the Laudato Si itself? Let me just say two things that make me wonder about how focused your critique is on Laudato Si itself. The first is you spoke early on about in order to have a common home, we have to have a common language. And in your talk, and I think we've heard already in the speakers before, you accurately say the state of our world is not a world of a home that we work together on, but a place of conflicting self-interests and self-interested groups. And I certainly don't disagree with that at all. But that said, an overwhelming thread that runs all through Laudato Si is the call for dialogue. Right. And the call for dialogue doesn't deny the fact that we don't know how to talk to each other. It's a call for talking together so that we can learn together. And then the second thing is about whether Laudato, and I'm not sure that you're saying this about Laudato Si itself or certain people who've taken it and used it in certain ways, that it's more concerned with the technocratic aspects of the house, of Earth, I guess, with a big E, or the planet.
Right.
The thing that Pope Francis says he's bringing to the dialogue is a specifically Christian, although we share it certainly with other monotheistic traditions, notion of creation as the gift from a loving God. Mm-hmm. And the last chapter of Laudato Si is all about ecological education and spirituality. Yeah. So it is calling for building the resources that are needed to accept and embrace the fact that this is not our planet, it's God's gift to us, just as any of us is given a home by our parents. So I'm not sure how you see Laudato Si itself. You didn't mention those things in your evaluation of it, so I wonder if you could respond to that.
There's a lot there. Right. I will say, I think that if Pope Francis had had a clear idea of the difference between house and home, he may have written a better and a different encyclical that would have helped to kind of parse some of these distinctions, because there's a lot of confusion that reigns throughout the text as a result of not kind of noting the distinction between them. That said, there are lots, I think a lot of the positive places in the encyclical are where he's trying to articulate a notion of sharing a common home as distinct from a house. But again, because the distinction isn't clearly made, a lot of times things get confused and conflated that could be distinguished in some way. And so I guess that's the larger framing of part of this. In terms of the theological question at the end, I mean, I'll just say where I'm at in my own thinking. As a result of this, I'm not comfortable with this gift talk, at least on a more homely level. So we'll leave. Let me bracket the creation and receiving that as God's gift to us. I don't think that a parent can give a home to a child. We share a home. Sharing is the only way in which a home is enjoyed. And so I can give a house, I can provide somebody with a framework for that, but we share a home, and it's through the sharing of labor in various ways. And I think newborns do that in their own way, and it goes, I mean, everybody does. And so I think about L'Arche communities in which there are people who are severely mentally or physically unable to fully participate, but yet they still are a part of that sharing in the labor of caring, and that's a good example of what it means for a home. But then it raises, for me at least, and I haven't thought through it theologically how to understand, but I think this is where a house-home distinction and thinking about sharing and the sharing of labor as constitutive of a home might give us a different way of understanding how we're supposed to relate to creation. And it's through sharing in that rather than thinking of it simply as a gift that's been received. But
I think that's a good response. I accept that. I think that that's certainly God in the Christian tradition and arguably in the other monotheistic traditions was trying to get through the fact that we share this home.
yeah,
And we weren't listening very well.
and we share in the ongoing unfolding of creation.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a good question.
I shouldn't, but I'm going to exercise my prerogative to let one more question go. Because I'm really fascinated with the conversation that's taking place. But then we'll have to move on. So please, Taylor, you can take the last one.
I have a question about whether further distinctions amidst modalities of home need to be made.
Yeah.
Because for me, the question is who's making home where? And I wonder whether this articulation of the distinction between house and home is not true to the history of settler colonialism or to race indigeneity. So what does it mean for settlers to make home here, and how is that different from indigenous folks making home in a settler colonial context like the United States?
Right.
I wonder if the term homesteading even.
Well, homesteading is a great, because I think homesteading is playing the Indian in many instances. I think of folks like, I live in Virginia, Joel Salatin uses indigenous language and symbols in many instances to make home.
Right.
And it seems to me like settler homemaking is parasitic.
Yeah. It's housesteading. It's not homesteading.
Yeah.
At the end of the day. And I think there's a whole discourse that in fact the colonizers have never been at home here. They've never even attempted to become at home here, in part because they impose regimes of work upon the sharing of labor that preceded it. Although I'm not going to give a pass to all indigenous groups either. They're a very complex mix in which there's all kinds of indigenous traditions which are just as bad as the European ones in terms of their own versions of like settler colonialism and so on, in which they weren't able to make home very well either. And so I'm thinking of a very specific strand within anthropology and within history as being quintessentially as providing us the understanding that we need about what constitutes a home as opposed to a house. But yeah, I think we do need to make distinctions, and a lot of what we take to be a home isn't a home at all.
If you join me in thanking.